to make some last announcements for the class, and then I have to send out an email to the rest of the class with some of these just as refreshers. So if you see that and it sounds like it's all repetitive, that is why. But this is going to be our last meeting of the semester, so we won't have class on Wednesday. I still have a handful of people that haven't come in to do the meeting with the professor assignment, and I think I've met with most of you who are here. But if anybody hasn't yet gotten it done, you have a few more chances to get that done. One is Wednesday, so during our normal class time, I will still be on Zoom, even though there is no class. For anybody that wants to get that assignment done, or anybody that needs any help with any of that stuff. Yeah, okay, I see the, so yeah, so you still have time, you still have a few opportunities to get that done. And so during office hours, so I will still have my normal office hours this week after our class today, and then after class time on Wednesday. And then I will also have office hours during final exams week. So just a reminder that on final exams week, most professors don't have the regularly scheduled office hours, and like everybody's schedule is thrown off, right? And because of administering final exams and all of that. So my office hours for next week are going to be different than the ones for this week. So this week, it's still my normal office hours, Monday, Wednesday, 3 to 4. And this is where you get the link for it, right? On the homepage of our website. If you just click on this Monday, Wednesday, 3 to 4, that's the link to the office hour link. Otherwise, if you come during class, you just use the class Zoom link. But for next week, I will be in the same office hour Zoom, but it's going to be Tuesday from noon to 2. So very different times than I normally have office hours in, just because I try to pick a time that is most likely to work for people in between when normal final exams usually get administered. If none of those work, you can still make a separate appointment with me. I've had a couple of people who my office hours and the class times just didn't work for them to get the meeting with the professor assignment done. And they just send me an email, tell me when is more convenient for you to meet. And I've been able to meet with everybody that has sent me an email. Usually I ask, give me a couple of maybe times when you can do it, just in case I can't, but it hasn't been an issue. So don't be afraid of asking for a different time, right? But so again, normal class time on Wednesday, and then final exams office hours on Tuesday of next week are your last few chances to get that done, the meeting with the professor. Also, only one assignment. This yesterday felt really weird. I was like, okay, I'm not getting emails from anybody. I'm not waiting for an assignment to be submitted by everyone. Just the final paper, right? So we're in week 16. I put the prompt here, but it's not due until Wednesday, May 18th by midnight, right? But if you want to get it done early, right, you can get it done this weekend, and then you can check something off. So once again, and just really quick, it's a 2-page paper in which you connect the material we've been discussing in class. You don't have to pick everything, just one of the topics we've discussed in class to something that is happening more recently. Right, something more recently, and then you answer these questions in like kind of essay paragraph form, right? So it's less academic. I don't need you to have a thesis. You don't need to do any research. You don't need to cite anything unless you actually use the newspaper article or an article online that discuss the topic. Then you would cite it. And I don't care how you cite. You can cite Chicago style, you can cite MLA, APA, whichever style you use, as long as you cite. Right? If you are reading a Wikipedia page or an article online and you're using that to answer some of these questions, cite it. Cite it. We don't want your last paper to be flagged for plagiarism, especially when it's something that's a little bit more just your take, right? The way you are making connections between the class and maybe something that's going on today. What questions do you have about the final paper? I want to make sure and get it, all of those answered if there are any. No, I'm going to add something to the potential topics because it became an issue in the time we've met since last week. You can choose to discuss the end of Roe v. Wade. It's something that we've discussed. We've discussed the history of contraception, eugenics, and abortion to some extent in this class. So if that is a topic that is on your mind right now and you would like to write your final paper on that, you can. Right? Some of the things you can talk about are the forced sterilization of women and that history, right? And how that is about reproductive rights, right? And you can write just about the discussions of how it all does connect to issues of race and ethnicity. Right? When we talk about who will be the most affected with the end of Roe v. Wade, we're talking about primarily low income Black and Latino women that will be affected because they are less likely to be able to afford to travel out of state if they live in a state that will ban abortions. They're more likely to not be able to travel out of state to get a legal medical abortion. And so they're more likely to try things that might be dangerous. The world we live in today is very different than the world that existed before Roe v. Wade, right? So the same dangers don't exist. People are not going to necessarily experience the same dangers, but there is some level of danger where people don't know what resources there are, right? Like wire hangers are not necessary anymore to perform an abortion. People are more likely to try is getting the pills necessary, or going to a doctor that can perform it. But there are still dangers when people don't know where to go, how to access things, especially when they live in a place where it's not easy to find that because it's illegal. Right? So you can discuss all of that if you like, right? And how the organizations you're seeing speak out on the topic today, how they're engaging with the topic of race, if they are at all. Right? I'm seeing some of them are, but I follow like a lot of organizations that deal with this topic because I think I had mentioned this is my area of research. I follow a lot of organizations that are engaging with these topics today. Some of them I think are engaging with the issue of race and ethnicity and how different groups of people will be affected by the Supreme Court decision that is likely to come in a month, but not all of them. Not all of them. So that's one thing that you can discuss, right? If there's a particular organization you're following. So you don't have to, right? I want to emphasize that your final paper does not have to be on this topic. I just realized that it's in the news right now. A lot of people are talking about it, and it might be something that you're already interested in, right? And because this is my area of expertise, I thought I would ask, does anybody have any questions about the history of abortion, of Roe v. Wade, about any of this stuff, since everybody's been talking about it? And it's an emotional topic, right? People have emotional political positions and emotional responses to these topics. But if anybody has any questions on the history, it's usually things I can answer, especially given how, there's a lot of information flying around. Some of it good and other stuff, not quite so good. No, I'm like, if at any point, right, anybody, even after the end of class, you find something online and you're like, wait, is this point true? You're always welcome to reach out to me because I'm always on top of these discussions most of the time. And I teach a class that's dedicated just to the history of reproductive rights in the honors program. And you've seen how I've woven a lot of that in here, but there's always a lot more to cover. right? The main thing that I've tried to do with the topic in this class is discuss how it particularly has affected ethnic and racial minority groups, right? It does tend to affect racial and ethnic minority groups different than white populations, right? Because of the problem of class and money, and in the politics in around these topics in this country. Right. It's so as you see some of these debates happen and these fights over these political questions, keep an eye out for that. See if you can spot where arguments and points reflect particular ideas about race and ethnicity. Right. Because it's not always, people won't say it up front a lot of the times, but it's implied, or there's a kind of cultural understanding that an audience will have, right? For example, about who they imagine is getting pregnant and what the potential outcomes are. People usually have ideas in their head about who that is and how impacts will play out. And on both sides of the question that is true. And if you're interested at all, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of like the scholarship, the history, the sociology, and the medical aspects of those topics. But like I said, you don't have to talk about any of that in your paper if you don't want. The other topics that you might be interested in that directly relate to things we've been talking about in class are, for example, the problem of racism, especially of racism within police departments, right? And how this affects policing, especially violence against Black and Indigenous and Latinx men in particular, right? We talked a little bit about how race was a key element of during the Obama administration, in part because one of the biggest, the first controversies that President Obama had to tackle when he became president was one of racism towards Henry Louis Gates, his professor at an Ivy League, who was pulled over and he believed was unfairly treated by a police officer. Right? Immediately, the reaction from Fox News and other conservative outlets was to say that Obama's comments on the controversy had showed that he was racist, right? That Obama was racist and that he was being unfair to the police officer and to just the police force in general. So Obama had organized this beer summit, between Henry Louis Gates, the officer that pulled him over, at the time Vice President Biden and Obama, and they all had a beer and they allowed the cameras to come in and this was a way of trying to resolve this controversial element. But then later on in his presidency, there were several incidences of police violence, police killing unarmed Black men and boys. And the one that stood out the most was the death of Trayvon Martin in 2013. Because he was asked about it. And every time there was any high profile case that started getting attention, President Obama was asked about it. And in particular, his response to the death of Trayvon Martin really hit a nerve. At the time, this had happened in Florida, and there was some attention on the case. It was gaining more and more attention because Trayvon Martin had been unarmed. He was a minor. And most people who were paying attention to the case tended to view it as an unlawful killing of a young Black boy, right? This was before President Obama commented on it. Then he was asked about it, and President Obama said the quote that's on the PowerPoint slide, right? And he said that if he'd had a son, his son would look like Trayvon Martin. And that really hit a nerve with people. People had strong reactions to hearing President Obama say that. Why do you think? why do you think people had strong emotions when hearing the president of the United States say that he viewed this boy who was killed like somebody who could have been his son, and who could have very likely also experienced the racism that Trayvon Martin experienced? No, is it too political? I think part of it was for a lot of people that wanted to view President Obama as being a president, like a Black president who was primarily trying to benefit Black people, right? They viewed his comment as reinforcing their idea that Obama was himself racist against white people, right? People heard that when they heard this statement, right? For other people, for a lot of especially Black Americans, they heard what Obama was saying and they were like, yeah, that's how we feel when we hear these kinds of news on TV or on newspapers or on social media. This is how we feel. We feel that could have been us, that could have been our sons, our nephews, our kids. And so it put a lot more attention on the case than it would have otherwise, because the president was commenting, and because all of a sudden, because he commented, it became a bigger political incident, right? Where everybody had an opinion, and their opinion seemed to be based really on what side of the political divide people fell on. So it was definitely about race, and then very much about politics and which political party you were supporting. We saw very similar dynamics occur in Ferguson a couple of years ago with the death of George Floyd, right? With big important differences, right? A couple of things that happened in Ferguson in 2020 that were different from some of the police killings that had happened when Obama was president and even before, right? A lot of you actually watched Gook, the video that engaged with the topic of like the LA riots after the Rodney King verdicts. And while there was a somewhat similar response after the death of George Floyd, one of the key differences is that there were multiple videos, right? Multiple videos of the police officers engaging with George Floyd and clear uses of too much force. Most people that looked at the videos could see that there was an excessive use of force. Even police officers looking at those videos say, whoa, yeah, that police officer went too far. And it led to this national conversation about police violence and protests all over the country, right? Usually when this happens, right, it's about more than one incident, right? The incident is critical for inciting the protest and inciting a discussion of the topics. But it's usually sparks such a wide interest because people can relate to it all over the country, right? And that was one of the things that came out of that conversation, right? A discussion of how different police departments, especially large police departments, cities like Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Chicago, all of these places, and the high numbers of excessive use of force among some of these in some of these police departments, right? But there's a lot of parallels to what had happened in 1992 with the uprising or riots in LA, and what had happened in previous decades. Similar incidences had happened in the 70s, and the 60s, and the 80s, right? So why are these incidents still happening, right? Why do you think? You could say we've studied some of this history, not in depth, really. We could have gone way more in depth, but we looked at some of this, and it's really the very similar story, right? Excessive use of force that ends in a Black man being killed, right, by a police officer, and then sparks outrage and it sparks protest in the city that it happens, and then across the nation. Why haven't we been able to fix this problem, do you think? I'm just asking you for your opinion, not to solve world racism. You think that having experienced decades and decades of these kinds of incidences and the kind of unrest that it lead to, that we should have been able to figure out how to prevent and stop these kinds of instances from occurring, but we haven't. Why do they keep happening?
I think the sort of authority that police departments have has been so kind of codified in our society that a lot of the brutality is sort of an attempt to enforce their power dynamic. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, right? And in fact, the power of police departments has increased, and their abilities have increased.
Become militarized.
Yeah, the people point about the kinds of weapons, and why do police departments need tanks and weapons that are typically used by the armed forces?
There's the idea of the state has a monopoly on violence, and they're the enforcers of it.
Olavo, I see you. I think you were muted, but I think you were talking.
Yeah, now I realize. Hey, I'm sick. I got a COVID too. Yeah. So my opinion is that I think we need to come back the bias police has about Black people, African American people. This is a good problem. This is have to change because they see all the time the Black as a not good and bad. Is
So that's a good point, and that is the larger issue, right? Why haven't we been able to eliminate racism in this country, right? Yeah. And the studies do show that this is still a significant problem. It's a significant problem when people are making hiring practices. Yeah. Sometimes we call it unconscious bias because sometimes people aren't even aware. Like, it's not like they think Black people are terrible and they don't want to hire a Black person, right? People don't say that or don't believe that. But when they're trying to hire someone for a job, even with the resumes being exactly the same, this is what the studies have shown, that hiring managers are still most likely to pick a white candidate as opposed to a Black or Latino or any other race or ethnicity, right? They've also done studies of, for example, how people just view different racial and ethnic groups. And it's become very clear that, and this is not just police officers, this is the, society, Americans as a whole, when shown a picture of Black men and Black teenagers and boys, and not a white and non-Black audience tends to guess the age of the Black person they're seeing as much older than they actually are. Yeah. So when they see a picture of a Black boy, they think he's way older than his actually age. So he is being viewed as a man rather than as a boy. Mm. And that is, they've done this with police officers and police departments, and then with people in more general, and that has been true in every population they've looked at. Initially, we thought that one of the ways we could solve this problem of racism within police departments was to make police departments more racially diverse. Right? Because when you looked at police departments before the 70s, they were primarily white. Right? So it kind of made more sense that, okay, of course, racism is deeply entrenched because it's a white only police department. So the solution that a lot of reformers had come up with is to integrate police departments to make them more racially diverse. And over the course of the 80s and the 90s, that actually occurred. That was very successful. When you look at police departments today, they are much more racially diverse than they have ever been.
Yes, sure.
But has that made any difference? The answer is no.
Uh-huh.
Whether it's a Black, white, or any kind of racial or ethnic group, it seems to not make a difference to reduce instances of use of, or overuse of force. The number of complaints police departments get has either stayed the same or gone up, depending on the police department you look at. And in instances of people being killed while in police custody does not decrease significantly when you have a more diverse police force. People have done the studies. Very few things seem to make a difference in terms of the things we've tried to reform within police departments. Once somebody joins the police force, there's a kind of culture and ideas that people adopt when they become part of it. So reforming it from within or trying to change attitudes from within a police department seem to be very difficult, right? Because it's a very rigid system. It's a very rigid culture within police departments. When you're a member of police department, it's a kind of brotherhood, and people very close knit kind of groups.
Yeah.
One thing that does seem to make a difference is female police officers. But it's not a foolproof solution. It's not a solution to it. But one of the things that reformers point to is that when police departments hire more women, the instances of use of police force and of people dying while in police custody does go down. That female officers are less likely to use too much force or to allow people to die in their custody. Why that is? We don't know, because it's not that women are less likely or less violent, right? Like studies of that have also been done. Women can be quite violent. Sometimes we pick different ways of being violent or different ways of being unlawful. But it does seem to make a difference. They are less likely to do that. There's also other practical things that have been applied, like, for example, when a suspect is being chased by an officer, that the person doing the chasing is not the arresting officer. If they're not the ones who are mainly engaging with the suspect, there's less likely to be violence in the incident, right? So some police departments across the country have implemented those rules. Like if you're the one chasing a suspect, then you're not going to be the arresting officer, because after a suspect has made you chase them, has put you through all of that, the person who's they usually want to get some sort of revenge for, hey, you just made me go through all of this, and usually something as simple as the pursuing officer is not the arresting officer makes a difference in getting those numbers of use of force down. Right. There's other things. Anybody that's interested in, obviously, those of you that are like criminal justice majors and pre-law and all of that, there's some really interesting ways in which people have tried to tackle this, but they tend to be at a small scale, right? One, a police department has to be willing to bring in experts and be willing to make changes within the police department. That's difficult. The person in charge has to be willing to do that. Right. And in a lot of police departments, there is a distrust of outsiders who are not law enforcement officers coming in and telling them what they're doing wrong. Right. There's a huge distrust of that. Right. other big differences though that I've seen just in like historically, right, in the last few decades, calls to defund the police are really, they're not brand new. These calls to defund the police have existed for a long time, right? It's why people are now rediscovering writers like Angela Davis. She's been writing about prisons and the need to do away with prisons for a long time. But this is the first time that there have been significant calls, right, where it's not just a fringe minority group who is making this argument, right? Part of it is probably because of wider scale understanding of how prisons work, right? Documentaries like what is it called, the 13th Amendment, and people doing more outreach into communities, talking about how bad prisons can be and how they function as a kind of slavery, the inequalities of the criminal justice system and of prisons. More people know about it, and the more people know about it, the more they're likely to then want to either reform or completely redo a system. So that might be one reason for it. It's still not a majority of the American public, right? A majority of the American public does not support defunding police departments. And there's different interpretations of what that phrase means practically, right? What does that mean? Does it mean just reducing their budget? Does it mean completely eliminating a police department? Does it mean investing more in social work? Right, so that police officers don't have to answer to every like call of domestic abuse and things that a social worker is more better trained to handle. Because police officers aren't trained, right? They're not trained, they're not well trained on how to deal with like people who are having mental health issues and these kinds of things. And then the other big difference I hear is the particular phrase, right? Black Lives Matter. Now, the first time that phrase became popular to use, there was a lot of questions about what does that mean? Yeah. Especially amongst the white population. Does that mean that only Black lives should matter? Exactly. I had to have several conversations with white friends and family members about this, because at first you hear the phrase and you think, wait, that sounds racist. Right. And so, but a lot of activists and a lot of young people just did a lot of work in like making the case that it was not about Black lives mattering more. Right? That the argument they were making was that Black lives have not been valued in this country, and that they should be valued at the same kind of scale in which white lives have mattered. And actually, Black Lives Matter has been pretty successful at making their argument. Right, that phrase actually has worked. You see it because the way it's been adopted, right? I see even where I live, a lot of the like blue Lives Matter iconography, the bumper stickers, the flags, all of that. Right, something about that phrase really works to the point where people have adopted it, and they'll switch out the Black, right, and they will put in whatever interest group they're focusing on, right? So it's really interesting actually to have seen how that has changed. And to me, how the phrase Black Lives Matter has been adopted and readopted by different groups speaks as to how successful those activists were at making their case. Right. But okay, so this happened a couple of years ago now. What has so people have been more aware of the problem of police violence, especially towards Black men. What has actually practically changed, though, since all of that activism? Anybody that pays attention to those issues, is anybody able to say what has practically changed in the last 2 years?
Not a whole lot.
Yeah, more people are likely to join calls to defund the police. There's more support for things like that. But the studies all show that police budgets have actually increased. Have not gone down. They've actually increased. Although, have you noticed there is a lot of focus every few months in the last year or two, there's been a lot of focus on the rise in crime. Right. And this is, I predict as a historian looking at the history of these issues, I think that that's going to be a big deal in the next round of elections. The increase in crimes
is like a reactionary backlash.
I think so. Yeah, because some things have practically changed in some communities, right? Like you look at it, if you follow like apps like Nextdoor or community boards, people are really worried about how shoplifters are no longer arrested and sent to jail, right? In certain places, like I know it in one of the grocery stores near me has done that. They don't prosecute shoplifters. If somebody shoplifts, you're supposed to just let them go. You call the police, you can file a report, but you're not supposed to engage with the shoplifter. And a lot of older people in my particular community have been very outraged at that. Very outraged. And I don't know if I haven't seen the numbers if in my community there's been a spike in crime, but people feel like there's a spike in crime. And usually that tends to be used by candidates who can make a case that if they get elected, they will bring law and order, right? They will make the community safer. It's a very good political argument. It's very effective. People want to be safe. And there, for voters, it doesn't matter what race or ethnicity the voters are. People react really positively to politicians who promise that they will bring peace and stability to the community. It includes Black voters, Latino voters, almost all racial and ethnic groups react positively to those kinds of political messages. Yeah.
I was gonna say in my area, there's been a big spike in homelessness, and a lot of the politicians are now their messaging is basically talking about homeless people like they're criminals and they're just going to get rid of them and stuff like that. And unfortunately, a lot of the voters seem to react positively to that rather than treating the root causes. Just get rid of these people.
Yeah, and then that's the thing. I saw one of those types of ads yesterday, but it was for a sheriff. So it makes much more sense when in those kinds of races for sheriffs, the focus on crime. But pay attention and see if other politicians will also pick up on that, because especially when it proves successful in like sheriff's races, they end up being, politicians all over the country begin picking up those similar slogans or similar political ads. Yeah. Homelessness, though, yes. And because when people hear the word homelessness, right, one is typically something that people know, right? If there seems to be an increase of homeless people in the community, it's something you can see and feel like, hey, I see them right there. And what's the city doing for it? And cities and states, communities have not done a very good job of addressing the problem of homelessness. Because it's usually a complex issue, right? It usually has layers of mental health, because a lot of homeless people have mental health issues and need care. It also there are also important issues of addiction, because a lot of homeless people struggle with addiction. But right now, we've also had a lot of issues of people losing their homes because of COVID, because they lost their jobs. So the economy, things like that, all also play into it. But so it ends up being a really complex issue that nobody really has the one answer to it, because it usually takes more than one thing to fix the problem. And also it doesn't make for a nice political message when you tell people, wait, this is complex. We will sit down with with a bunch of experts and we will tackle this in complex issues, in complex ways. Voters don't want to hear that. They want to hear that the politician has the solution.
Right.
And that they will come in and they will fix it. It doesn't even matter if the politician offers a solution or not. They just want to, voters tend to want to hear that there's a solution. And they don't want to just provide services, right? They don't want to just provide housing. That has tended to be the pattern, at least when it comes to the issue of homelessness, that people don't just want to offer something for free. There has to be a sense of, okay, we're going to fix the issue, but we don't actually want to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right? Because if it's associated, one way in which people can get attacked for wanting to tackle the issue of homelessness is, are my taxes going to go up? And if their taxes are going to go up, people don't end up not liking those solutions.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm like, so the answer for anybody that is actually working on those issues tends to be really difficult to come up with a political solution or to get politicians to actually do something meaningful on it, because politicians answer to voters, and some things play well with voters and other things don't. But by the way, if you want to tackle that in your final paper, you can, and you don't have to have the answer. You can just talk about what are all the complicated elements that come into play here. Right? What are the complex nature of the problem? The other thing that I want to bring up as a potential topic for your final papers is the presidency of Donald Trump. Although it has ended, potentially only for the moment, right? He's been doing campaign rallies in different parts of the country, but if you were really active in different movements during the years of the Trump presidency, right? You can talk about how the movement that ends up making him president began. It really began with the Tea Party. Well, it probably began before. We can trace some of these issues way back, very distinctly to even the Reagan administration and even further. But the particular movement here, right, that puts him in the presidency can be traced back to the Tea Party and the protest of President Obama in Obamacare. That brought people who were not necessarily always attending political rallies or always paying attention to politics out into political rallies and to protest. Right? They were protesting Obamacare and generally just the presidency of Barack Obama. Right? And he also had a message that spoke to a lot of particularly white Americans. That obviously his appeal was wider than just white Americans, but there was an appeal there about political correctness and social change. Right? A lot of people who liked the way he was attacking political correctness felt like the world has changed so much in the last 8 years. Now I'm having to learn people's pronouns, or I can't just call someone the thing that I've been calling them my whole life. I have to now worry about not offending people. Right? That spoke to a lot. Even people who didn't vote for him would oftentimes say he has a point. He makes a good point when he talks about political correctness has taken over. Right? I heard it from a lot of people who were like, he actually has a point about that. And it's hard to make a case for people that, hey, it's okay for these changes to occur, because they just feel like, hey, all of a sudden I can't say things that are racist, but they've been okay my whole life. And people felt that there had been a genuine, like the changes had been too big. right? Too big. That the election of our first Black president represented like too much change. Right? He also really spoke to people who, well, on the people on the element of gay rights and marriage equality. I'd be interested to hear what you all think, but because he wasn't against gay rights and marriage equality, he hadn't in his political life always been against it, but his base, especially because he really tended to make an appeal to a lot of religious conservative voters, didn't agree. Like they were not in favor of extending gay rights and marriage equality. And so when the Supreme Court, legalized gay marriage in the country, they felt like this is a huge thing that Trump can address, right? These kinds of things that have gone too far. What did you all say in the TEDC? Alexis says, I've had conversations and I made agreements with them, like a big change in our country. Yeah, I'm like that was very common. And then his main issue and initial appeal was really on the topic of immigration, right? Because his first speech, where he declares himself for President Trump, when he declared himself a candidate for the presidency, in that speech, he made immigration a key part of his platform. Right? He said, ending illegal immigration, building a wall. And those were the cries, the slogans and the words that got chanted over and over again in his rallies. And he legitimately did try to deliver on those topics, right? He made significant changes when it came to immigration policy that actually President Biden campaigned on reversing. He campaigned on reversing a lot of President Trump's immigration policies, and he has not been able to deliver on most of those changes, right? The wall, well, I'm like, should I or not get into the issue of the history of building a wall between Mexico and the US? So that's been an interesting issue because historically, it's not until more recently that a wall has existed, any kind of wall has existed between Mexico and the US, because large parts of that border are desert areas that are very dangerous, period, right? Like they don't need a wall because they're very dangerous climate zones. But that has begun. That has not been a new thing under President George W. Bush. There's a movement of border security. President Obama also made a lot of made border protection a key part of his policies and of deporting people back to their home countries. One of the key and most lasting, though, influences that the Donald Trump presidency had was this policy of making refugees wait in Mexico, the Remain in Mexico policy. Because typically, the people that come to the border, any of the borders, but when they seek refugee status, that is perfectly legal. That's a procedure that goes through the courts. Somebody can petition for refugee status that gives them a legal status in the US. It goes through the courts, but while the courts decide whether to grant a refugee status, people have been allowed to stay in the US for that time. And then depending on what the courts rule, then people are either allowed to remain under a refugee status or they might be sent back to their original countries. Well, with the Remain in Mexico policy, Mexico has been forced to house all these refugees, which has created even more dangerous situations at the border. Because what you have is a lot of like tent cities that have popped up in border towns like Tijuana, where you have large numbers of people, hundreds and thousands of people in a border city that was not prepared to house and feed all those people. And on top of it, the immigrants that are staying in Mexico are viewed in Mexico in very racist ways, because they tend to not be Mexican immigrants, right? There are people from Central America, but also from the Caribbean. And a lot of them are of indigenous background, and a lot of them are Black immigrants. Like right now, there's a huge number of Black Haitian immigrants who had been deported to Mexico. Like they were not sent back to Haiti, they were sent to Mexico. And it creates a huge problem because there weren't set resources in Mexico to help these Haitian immigrants who were seeking refugee status, were denied it. And now, how do you get them back home? What do you do with this significant population of Haitian immigrants? Where, you know, they're Haitian, so they don't speak Spanish. And don't know how to navigate the Mexican political system, right? So it's created a huge problem in Mexico and in the US with how to manage all these people, right? All of this came into play with the start of the pandemic, right? Because in a country in which, like we talked about at the beginning of the class, right, racial diversity don't actually exist biologically. Scientifically, there's not a lot of difference between somebody with darker skin and somebody with lighter skin. There just is not. It's not a genetic difference. It is not a biological difference. But it exists. And somehow in this country, I'm like, things become racialized, right? Sometimes I see people talking about how, well, not everything's about race. I'm like, no, it shouldn't be about race, but it is. It becomes about race, right? So a global pandemic became very much about race, right? One, in the way we made connections to who was responsible for COVID-19, right? The way in which Asian Americans have been made like responsible for it. And there's been an increase in violent attacks towards Asian Americans, right? At that point, right, it came all the way from the top with politicians and even President Trump using phrases like Kung flu, right? Saying that, oh, it's like a flu, it's a Chinese disease. And then, you know, it just, the way people heard it is just like, we can't distinguish between who is Chinese American and who, you know, different ethnic groups. So all of a sudden, all Asian Americans are responsible for this. And the very real consequences became an increase of violence across the nation of Asian Americans. Yeah. But the other big issue was who was mostly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, so many people have died across the nation, right? The COVID-19 doesn't care what race or ethnicity you belong to. It doesn't. It's a virus, so it just like it doesn't care. But who was mostly affected ended up being one, indigenous populations have experienced, you know, some of the most devastating effects. One, because they tend to be smaller populations anyway. So whenever there is a pandemic like this, any kind of loss of life is significant in terms of population numbers. So those have been some of the most, that has been one of the most affected in terms of numbers. Then the studies all kind of, depending on where the numbers are being gathered and who's doing the number gatherings and when, in which month they're gathering numbers, some of these fluctuate who was more or less affected, but these three groups tend to be the most affected in general. So indigenous populations, Hispanic populations, right? And I use that term here because that's the demographic category that people use. And Black populations tended to be the most affected. So the most likely to get COVID-19 and have cases of needing hospitalization, and then most deaths have been in these populations. We'll see how that progresses, especially as COVID-19 becomes endemic and as better treatments for it hopefully will become available to everyone. But some of you have seen it. Some of this we can see in LA County itself, right? And we can see that a lot of it does have to do with income, right? And that, okay, these three groups tend to be more severely impacted because they're more likely to be low income. Right? And so in low income jobs, missing one day is a significant effect. Right? You lose a lot of money when you miss a day. And if you get COVID-19, especially earlier in the pandemic, you would have to be home for longer. You just have to be home for longer. Also less likely to be able to take the day off to go get the vaccine and deal with the side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine. Right? These three groups were also less likely to know that, not now, but before that, the COVID-19 vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, or the Johnson & Johnson, that they were being offered for free. There was still a lot of lack of information in low-income communities that the vaccine was free, that the testing was free. And so because these are communities where they were less likely to be insured, they were also less likely to seek help when they became sick. Yeah. And it's something that we're still dealing with, right? How different populations, different racial and ethnic groups have been disproportionately affected by it, right? Who has the money to stay home, so to who has the money to access treatment and health insurance and treatment and all of that. It's playing a huge role, and I don't see very many people talking about that, especially now. Right? Do you guys see any of that? Have you guys seen anybody could keep talking about the disproportionate effects of the pandemic?
I've heard a little bit of it, but not so much in mainstream spaces, more kind of political spaces that I have it online.
Yeah, I'm like, if you're following the right people, then you'll get some of it. Because there are activists who have been trying to engage with it, right? Immediately, like one of the things that in LA County, that we did here was activists were just, especially doctors, right, were forcing the county to open up vaccine clinics in low-income areas because in a lot of low-income areas, there just was not likely to be a healthcare center where the vaccine was being offered, especially when the vaccine was not widely available, right? Where they were still telling us in groups who can go get the vaccine. So there are activists, especially people very interested in public health, who have made this a key part of the way they are tackling the pandemic. But I think part of the problem is so many people across the country are just so tired of the pandemic. People don't even want to talk about it anymore. Right? Is that the feeling some of you are seeing too?
I think so, yeah, to some extent.
Unless, somebody who, I mean, there's still people getting sick. Olava, I hate to make this all about the COVID. I'm like, oh no, he's currently tackling this right now. But people are still getting sick. People are still being hospitalized. People that are vaccinated are less likely to be hospitalized, etc. But in a lot of places, the vaccine is no longer available for free. The testing is no longer for free. Like a lot of the federal funding for it ended in a lot of places, right? So the federal funding ended. Fortunately, in some states that it did not end. So in like California, you can still access the testing and the vaccine for free, but that's because of state resources, not because of federal funding. right? And so like in New York, same thing. A lot of that funding has remained in place because the state has taken over a lot of the federal efforts. But as a country, we've ended a lot of those free programs. And so well, I'm like, sometimes I get the hint. I'm like, I think it's going to, once things really end, when COVID-19 becomes endemic and we can talk about it having ended, then we'll be able to fully gauge what the effects were and the disproportionate nature of the effects. But even just from looking at the information we have now, there's enough information to see that race and ethnicity, because it's connected to income, has played a significant role in which communities are more affected. Right. And this is why I'm like, have any of you like participated in any kind of, there's been several organizations, including Cal State LA and the history department at Cal State LA and our archivists, to collect stories from students, especially from Latino students, about how you all have been affected by the pandemic. Have any of you submitted your stories? No one? It must be because I don't have enough history majors in here. Okay, then I'm gonna have to send an email with the link. I believe you can still submit, because usually, when we learn the history of these things, we tend to hear more or have more sources from particular communities and particular voices. And what a lot of people are trying to do right now is capture the stories of more than just white communities, right? Because a lot of like the conversation nationally and in newspapers and on television and on social media can a lot of times focus on white individuals and white communities. And so because we're in a very diverse part of the country and the world, we want to make sure that we archive and create sources for future historians of the LA County that include Latino, Black, Asian American voices on how the pandemic has affected them. So I'll send a link if you want to contribute your story. I think it's important to do that. As a historian, I always think it's important because nothing like hurts more a historian when you want to talk about race and ethnicity and the history of it, and you go to the archive, right? You go to like the public libraries, the documents that have been preserved by the county, by the state, and by the country, and you're not finding anybody writing their stories from minority communities, right? Because again, because of the connection to income, I'm like, if you're constantly worried about how you're paying rent, how you're paying for food, you don't have time to sit down and write your story so that it can be preserved by history. But that's why people need, the need to reach out to the community and say, hey, we're interested in your story, and it will be saved at Cal State LA digitally, so that in the future historians can access this archive of people's stories. Like a lot of times we tend to live our lives like our lives don't matter very much, right? Like who's gonna, that not believing that our name will ever be in a history book. But our stories do matter, right? They do matter. I think this has been a trend in history since the 60s and the 70s of not just analyzing the history of politicians and the history of of leaders, but also of trying to write the history of everyday people and seeing how the decisions of leaders and of politicians affects the everyday life. So ultimately, that's why it would matter, why somebody's decision matters, is because it ends up affecting a large group of people and how we live our lives, right? Whether we're happy or not. It affects, if you vote, it might affect how you vote, right? In both direct and indirect ways, right? So I'll send out a link and encourage everybody to submit their stories. I'm running out of time, and I just want to say that I really, again, don't be afraid to just giving me your thoughts in the final paper. That's really what I'm looking for, is just your thoughts. And hopefully that you've paid attention, or that something in class has struck a chord with you. I am not likely to be on campus in the fall. But if you ever see me around campus and you recognize my face, say hi. If you see me on campus, I will probably be in King Hall, usually up in the history department in the 4th floor. Sometimes I'll see students in King Hall, and you all turn away when I see you, and our eyes meet, and there's a recognition, and then people don't say hi. But especially because for a lot of you, I haven't actually seen your faces on a regular basis, right? Yeah. Even those of you that have pictures, right? Like I see you in a very glammed up way. That's not how you're likely to look when you're going up and down the stairs in King Hall. So if our eyes meet and I don't seem to recognize you, just say hi. I'm gonna assume it was somebody I had in an online class, and I just didn't see their face enough to remember it. But I'm always I'm always glad when students don't pretend they don't know me. I've had too many instances of students turning away, and I'm like, did I fail them? I don't remember failing them. So thank you, by the way, also for being such troopers. This class was, the class started off very oddly, because I didn't meet you until week 4 of the semester, and you guys were like in limbo for all those weeks. I didn't realize that you guys had literally not had been in limbo for that long. Usually departments don't like to put you in limbo, and then with a change of syllabus and change of books and all of that, I'm like, it's a miracle this class got to the end. But you all